actually on one occasion referred to a distinction, which he said had been made in Victorian language, between the deserving and the undeserving poor.
Keith Joseph, the former Conservative politician.
And he actually used that phrase at one point. Mind you, Keith Joseph got to remember that for some of the things he said himself.
Just interestingly, are you more aware of your language now than you might have been in, say, the 1980s?
Well, today, for reasons well beyond this programme, everyone has to be very cautious about the language. You can hardly say anything without people coming down at you like a ton of bricks, yes.
Now, Chris, for our final archive trip, we travelled to 2020 at the early stages of the pandemic. You were now the host, and it's an Any Questions First, presenting the programme from your very own living room.
I wouldn't recommend it.
It is March the 20th, and here's the Conservative MP, Bim Afalami, discussing the government's response to the pandemic.
The government is effectively just subsidising the wages of those workers so that when we're out of this crisis hopefully in 3 months' time, then the economy can go roaring back again and booming again.
Few would dispute that the scale of the intervention that we've seen from the government this week, it is absolutely colossal, and it isn't the brutal reality that hundreds of thousands, millions of people this weekend will justifiably fear that they're still going to lose their jobs.
If any employer is thinking of firing anybody or making them redundant, we are putting in place a coronavirus job retention scheme so that we will pay 80% of the salaries of those people. There is no reason, please, any employer, do not make people redundant. Look at all the help that is on offer.
So reference there, of course, to the furlough scheme. We started this conversation with rationing. We end post-pandemic. The Second World War and COVID, two shock events which saw enormous state intervention. I want to ask all of you, how do you think each changed expectations of the role of the state in supporting society? Chris?
It was interesting listening to my question to Bim Afalami and that concern about mass unemployment. That didn't happen, did it? The interjection of the furlough scheme, that absolutely, you can see it from space, colossal state intervention, which cost a fortune and has all sorts of implications around the public finances still, did prevent the very thing that was feared, really feared in government at the time, as well as all of the obvious health concerns around the pandemic, of mass unemployment on a scale that perhaps we'd never seen before. But it does prompt that thought, doesn't it, about where it leaves society and the political conversation now about the role of the state, when we all have in recent memory this colossal intervention, which, as I say, came with huge costs and leaves a sort of legacy for this government and future governments to potentially wrestle with, about what society now regards as normal in terms of the size of the state and the size of the tax burden, when factually both of those right now are really, really high. And how much scope for debate is there amongst parties and front benches that aspire to win elections to make an argument either to move significantly in one direction or the other?
The big difference between where we are coming out of the pandemic versus coming out of World War II is that the pandemic was this massive state intervention into the economy, subsidising the nation's wages, but it didn't leave any lasting institutions, right? The footprint of it is very, very small, apart from in terms of debt. I'm doing a bit of like vibes telepathy here, which is obviously an inexact science, but I just don't think that people have inflated expectations of the state. I mean, when I talk to people my age, people feel quite on their own, and I think that's because maybe this kind of care was so time limited. So we're going to do it for this period and nothing after that. It wasn't preempting a massive reorientation of what the state can do.
I reckon when Any Question gets to its 100th anniversary, vibes telepathy is going to be the language that gets teased. you know what they were saying
back to this programme.
Vibes telepathy.
Norman, the same principle to you really. What do you think in the post-COVID period, and again reflecting on the discussion we've had about things, how things have changed since 1948, what do you think people's expectations of the state are now?
Let me answer that. I agree that the Second World War left institutions, whereas COVID has not. But I think the key point is this, that both of them were exceptional events, very exceptional, once in a 100-year type events. And I think both of them run the risk of leaving people with the illusion that the state can do more than it can actually do. I think with COVID, too early to say, but I think there is this risk that COVID has encouraged people to think that the state can do far more and do far more competently than in reality it can. And I think it will take a few years before reality sinks in.
Well, I wish we could continue this fascinating conversation, but that is all we've got time for. Next time we talk Russia with Jonathan Dimbleby, Margaret Beckett and Peter Hitchens. But in the meantime, thank you to Chris Mason, Ash Sarkar and Norman Lamont. And thank you for listening.
Any Questions on the Welfare State was presented by Alex Forsyth and produced in Bristol by Camellia Sinclair. Now, Felicity Hanna is here with the news of today's Money Box Live.
Many of us use technology to manage bank accounts, pay bills, or just find a discount voucher for a takeaway. But not everyone is online, and that can cost them more than £1,000 a year in missed savings. Today, we're talking about the digital divide. Maybe you don't have digital skills. Maybe your rural broadband is too weak to work. Maybe you're worried about the risk of online fraud. If you can email, then do get in touch. It's moneybox@bbc.co.uk. If you can't, but you have someone who can contact us on your behalf, we would really love to hear from you today. And listen to Moneybox Live on the Digital Divide, just after 3.
BBC News at midday. President Biden has said it appears an explosion at a hospital in Gaza was not caused by an Israeli airstrike, but was carried out by what he called the other team. Hundreds of Palestinians have feared dead after the blast yesterday evening. Hamas has blamed it on Israel. Israel has shown evidence it says proves the explosion was caused by a rocket fired from a nearby cemetery by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group. Speaking alongside the Israeli Prime Minister shortly after arriving in Tel Aviv, Mr. Biden said he was outraged by the incident. From Jerusalem, here's our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams.
Joe Biden arrived in Israel in the midst of a storm of claim and counterclaim surrounding last night's devastating explosion at the Ackley Hospital in Gaza. Sitting with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mr. Biden said he was deeply saddened about the loss of life. He indicated he thought the explosion had been caused not by an Israeli airstrike, but by a Palestinian missile that had gone astray. During the course of his visit, the president will meet some of those Israelis affected by the Hamas attacks 11 days ago. A planned meeting in Amman tomorrow with the Jordanian king, Egyptian president, and the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas has been cancelled after Mr. Abbas pulled out.
Jennifer Austin from the United Nations Refugee Agency for Palestinians is in Gaza. She says people there are finding it difficult to understand what happened yesterday.
Everyone's just in trauma. There were sounds of silence from the camp, and it's usually people running around, children. You know, there's a lot of activity, but last night there was silence. People are just in shock and trauma that a hospital could be struck. It's just unbelievable.
Inflation remained steady at 6.7% last month. Food prices saw their first monthly fall in 2 years, but the rising cost of petrol and diesel contributed to a higher headline figure than expected. Reacting to the latest figures, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said inflation rarely falls in a straight line. Grant Fitzner is the chief economist at the Office for National Statistics.
This is not unusual if you look across Europe. Many countries have seen either periods lately of no change or in some cases actual increases in the headline rate before they started to resume their falls. There may be some disappointment out there, but of course we have seen significant falls in headline inflation over the last 6 months.
The police watchdog has launched an investigation into 6 serving and 2 former officers for potential gross misconduct over the handling of allegations against David Carrick. The former Met Police Constable was convicted of 49 offences last year, including 24 rapes. The Independent Office for Police Conduct is looking at 4 complaints made between 2002 and 2021. A man who abducted a primary school girl while dressed as a woman before sexually assaulting her at his home has been jailed for 20 years at the High Court in Edinburgh. Sentencing, the judge said that the actions of Andrew Miller, who's also known as Amy George, were nauseating. From the court, David Wallace-Lockhart reports.
Andrew Miller, also known as Amy George, abducted the schoolgirl after offering to give her a lift in February. He held her captive in his house near Melrose, where he subjected her to sexual assaults that Judge Lord Arthurson described as brazen and chilling, adding that the crime was nauseating in its level of depravity and criminal deviancy. The judge said that the fact that Miller was dressed as a woman during the abduction was an aggravating factor, telling the court that the primary school pupil would not with him if he had presented as a man. Lord Arthurson said that the abduction and sexual abuse of a child was a uniquely appalling crime and sentenced Miller to 20 years in prison.
And the Met Office has issued a rare red weather warning for parts of eastern Scotland tomorrow. Forecasters are concerned that the heavy rains and winds of Storm Babette could cause a risk to life. BBC News.
And we'll have the very latest from the conflict in the Middle East, from the ground or the world at one, in just under an hour's time. But now it's time for You and Yours with Peter White.
Hello, welcome to Radio 4's consumer programme. Today, the Transport for London scrappage scheme is hitting a few bumps in the road itself. We'll find out more. We'll hear how one woman got her money back from scammers by playing them at their own game. And chefs are in short supply at the moment. So I've been asking two people in the junior ranks why they want to do the job.
A lot of the time, all this intense sort of shouty stuff happens in the 2.5 hour period that is service, and at the end of that, you're all best mates again.
And we'll be talking affordable art. Tell us about any bargains you've come across, especially if they suddenly gained in value. You can contact the programme. You can email You and Yours at bbc.co.uk. On social media, use the hashtag You and Yours, or you can text 84844. Now, inflation rates were announced by the ONS this morning, and as we heard in the news, despite many predicting that we'd see a continued decline, they've stayed pretty much at the same as the rate in August at 6.7%. This is still well above the aimed 2%, but down from the 11.1% we were experiencing this time last year. Food and drink prices, along with household appliances and airfares, have all gone down. That's been offset by rises in petrol and diesel and hotel stays. Well, also released today is the monthly Asda income tracker, and that measures households' discretionary income, things like holidays, entertainment and hobbies, things we'd like to have but don't absolutely need. Sam Miley is economist at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, who do this tracker for Asda. Sam Miley, first of all, tell us about the income tracker itself. What does it show us, and what's it meant to measure?
So the Asda income tracker is a measure of household spending power, specifically a weekly estimate of a household's discretionary income, which is the amount that the average household has left over each week after they've contributed their taxes and covered a basket of essential goods and services such as housing, transport and foodstuffs.
Right, and I mean, is that at a specific amount that you kind of feel is a safe amount for what we might call discretionary spending?
So in terms of the estimate for September, we expect the average household to have had around £220 per week to spend on non-essentials once they've covered their rent, housing, foodstuffs, etc., which is slightly down on August's value, but is at a turning point compared to where we were last year, when we were experiencing much sharper rates of inflation.
Right, but that's an average, of course, and a lot of people were saying, God, I wish I had £220 left over.
Of course, yeah, that's measuring the average household, and there is quite a lot of divergence between different demographics. For instance, we look at different age groups, and we're seeing particularly younger households, those who don't have quite as much labour market security, are being particularly impacted by the rising cost of living and don't quite have the same amount to spend as the average household.
So given the headlines, but how do you read those latest inflation rates this month?
Well, a lot of economists had expected the rate of inflation to continue decelerating in September. What we have actually seen is a stagnant rate. In terms of what we anticipate looking forward, we think the impact from transport will gradually alleviate over the winter months, and